the last 6 years, I've done the moderating of this panel, but this year I've decided to unleash someone on the panel who hopefully will do a livelier job, because at this point in the weekend I'm exhausted. So with that, I want to introduce Jack Schaefer, who I believe is armed and dangerous. Jack.
I know everyone is experiencing conference fatigue, so I want you to take out your cell phones, turn the ringer on, because it's the only way we're going to stay awake for an hour and a half. We're all beat up, so please take out your phones and do that. Our panel, we got a great panel. Steve Engelberg is the editor-in-chief of ProPublica and a longtime investigative reporter and editor. Rainey Aronson-Rath is deputy executive producer for PBS Frontline. David Boardman is executive editor of the Seattle Times, and as we learned yesterday at the conference, a white male. Keith Suma of Univision is overseeing the network's partnership with ABC News to establish a new news channel. Other than that, we know very little about Mr. Suma. He declined to provide the Logan people with a biographical note or to respond to pre-interview questions. He is simply a cipher. I hope to use the investigative power that we're holding right now in this room to pierce his veil and figure out who the hell he is. Bill Bronstein does need an introduction, because nobody knows who he is. He is now the executive chair of the Center for Investigative Reporting. Previously, he was the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and prior to that, the San Francisco Examiner. But he's always been a great guy, such a great guy that I've named my 2 daughters after him. There's Phil Schaefer and Bronstein Schaefer. and both these fucking girls know how to break legs. And then we have Michael Oreskes, who's the senior managing editor of the Associated Press, which makes me ask, is there a junior managing editor? Is there?
Well, my question to you is, how come your copy's not as funny as you are?
It's going to be a great time here. All of our panelists are accomplished, but Mike Oreskes is more accomplished than all of them put together. I say this because 3 years ago, I was at dinner with Mike and several other people, and in the middle of the meal, under the most gentle interrogation from Mike about the subject of illicit drugs, which I've written about at great length, I nearly passed out. It's a true story, right, Mike?
It is.
And so that was some accomplishment. So to prevent that from happening, I will entertain no further questions from Mr. Oreskes. I can't promise that while asking him questions, I don't pass out. He has that effect on me. Our topic is the state of investigative journalism, a subject we return to every year to much hand-wringing. And my only rule is that while we're talking, there'll be no whinging. A little bit of hand-wringing, no whinging. And that I'm happy to report that there was very little whinging or hand-wringing yesterday, so I expect that tradition to continue here. My title here is moderator, but I thought of myself as an instigator since first grade when my teacher scribbled in my first report card, "Jack excels in his studies, but he likes to start fights on the playground and bring them back into the classroom." So that's what I'd like to see happen here. Rather than the kumbaya of how we all work so hard and we don't have enough money and the wheels are coming off, I want the panelists to mix it up. And we have kind of an interesting split here. We have 2 representatives from for-profit organizations, David and Keith, 2 who draw their paychecks from nonprofits and depend mostly on philanthropy to fuel their work. And then there's Mike. Mike works at a co-op that is owned by for-profit corporations, which makes him the sort of duck-billed platypus of the panel. So Mike,
I would like to correct. I work for a nonprofit, or a nonprofit that would like to be a for-profit.
Okay.
But it is a nonprofit.
well, if you're generating that sort of red ink, we'll qualify you there. Mike, I would like to get you to name your favorite non-AP investigative projects in recent months that have moved you and from which you've learned outside of AP, great investigative work.
Well, I think that several of the members of this panel have produced exceptional work at their shops. ProPublica's doing things all the time. And David, I think, has been leading the way. There are 3 or 4 newspapers in this country, in Seattle, Milwaukee, and a couple of other places who've really, I think, demonstrated the essential point that I hope this whole conference, in a sense, has been about, which is that we're at this moment, this turning point in the world of journalism, in which it's absolutely essential that the work we do be distinctive, that it stand out. We can't get away any longer with the kind of been there, done that, we're all kind of doing
Can you name some
parallels.
specific work, like you just cited the Milwaukee paper?
Well, I don't like to pick among my children, frankly, but and since they're all paying customers, I think I won't.
Well,
but,
do it, because otherwise I'll turn the panel loose on you.
Go ahead. I'm game. Go ahead.
All right.
Take it.
Phil, same question for you. Is there some work outside of CIR that you've really admired in recent months, which you learned from, hope to replicate, top?
Well, I mean, I think that David Barstow's work in the New York Times, I mean, not to focus on the New York Times, but the Avalanche story was, I think, a great experiment. And I read it front to back and felt that it had its flaws, as all experiments do, but it was worth doing and it was worth experimenting with. And so I like to see that kind of experimentation. I think that, you know, the danger that we have here is that we follow this path where we are sort of the overly earnest, soporific John Kerry, and, you know, we see our audience as sort of this frightening young Kim Jong-un, and we're trying to figure out what to do about it. And so I again, sort of to give a plug to trying new things, I think the Avalanche Project was one of those things.
Keith?
I loved the stuff we saw yesterday from Al Jazeera about the black prisons. I thought was pretty fascinating, and the way the energy of that and the way it's told was really very impressive to me. That to me is sort of a place we want to be in television.
David?
One local investigation that really stood out for me this year, the South Florida Sun Sentinel in Fort Lauderdale, did something. It was one of these stories that was so obvious and simple in its execution that it was absolute genius, and you wonder why nobody had thought of it before. They just using toll pass records, they showed that more than 800 police officers in the state of Florida had traveled at speeds between 90 and 130 miles an hour in 1 year, not on duty. And these cops had killed or maimed 21 people. Really outstanding work.
And what that piece required was the question asked and then digging into the state for the documents.
Yeah, yeah.
Heidi?
I was really encouraged by the work that CIR is doing on veteran affairs. You know, not that many people, and we found this out just looking at their work, actually cover the VA. And when they looked really hard at the benefits situation and people coming back and how the benefits were working, it was just a great shout out. And what's Aaron's last name?
Glance.
Yeah, he is just terrific. I thought his work was great. I thought he was great when he was doing media around it too.
What did you learn from it?
Well, I mean, I learned that the systemic issues facing the VA are huge. So all these changes that they've made, and people have come out, and Shinseki and others have said that they've really made changes, are years in the making. So a lot of these guys are going to fall through the cracks.
Steve?
I really loved both the New York Times and Bloomberg's work on China. Really just a kind of paradigm-shifting piece of investigative reporting, having had a very tangential look at how one might attempt to report on China, working with Matt Isaacs and Lowell on the Macau project and asking questions like, are there any records in China? Can we ever read them? The notion that 2 news organizations separately could get out there and really just, you know, that was one of those classic everybody knows it. Everybody knows the Princelings have money. Yeah, well, nobody knew how much. And when you saw that number and you saw how it was done and you saw the sort of pure corruption of modern China, that was remarkable, and I thought both news organizations did an amazing job.
Rating at Frontline, collaboration seems to be an important part of your sense of the state of investigative journalism. Can you talk about the collaboration moves that you guys have made recently?
Yeah, I mean, actually, we just looked at it. We sort of decided to do a map of how much we've moved into this space, and we found out that in the last 2.5 years, we've actually done 20 collaborations, which is a huge amount of work with 16 different partners. So here's my thing. I really believe in original journalism infusing frontline, right? And we believe in this idea with strong storytelling. So one of the things we've always done is collaborate, but we just kicked it up because, frankly, places like ProPublica, CIR, CPI, these groups were coming forward, and they were just terrific partners. And I think the big question for us is, how do you leverage each other, right? So we each care about our brands and our own success a lot. And I think something that was said on the book panel, which I think is really interesting, is how do I work with Steve and ProPublica on an investigation that changes so radically throughout the investigation, and how does production keep pace? I think the good news for production is production costs are plummeting, and they're a lot cheaper. So there's a way to actually move with investigative reporters in a way we just never would have been able to before. And keeping competitive with folks like Steve and others who need to publish a lot more readily and often, we've been publishing with them. And I think that's the other huge game change is our first project we did that on was Law and Disorder, where we said, okay, they need to be competitive, they need to keep up with who they saw as the competition. So we opened up a website and said, we'll keep up with you. And we started to publish alongside it. And a year later, the film came out. Didn't hurt the film. In fact, it helped the film. If anything, it galvanized support for the film and more people watched. So that, I really believe in this as a concept. It's, as Yossi was talking about yesterday, distribution is key, right? So if we use each other and leverage each other, generally we can make a bigger impact. This is what I see time and time again.
David, is there a downside from collaborating and partnering up and joining hands and getting in the campfire all together and
I didn't say campfire. Hey, you didn't ask me that.
I've got marshmallows here. Okay, we'll be toasting those.
I think it's far more positive than a negative. I do have the observation, by the way, having made the pitch for diversity yesterday, I appreciate that I'm the only one that's sort of down there in the trenches, from the provinces on this panel. But at the local level, the ability to collaborate, I think, is far, far behind what's happening at a national level. I'm really encouraged to see what's happening nationally, and I'm actually on the board of CIR, and I think it's an essential part of the fabric of CIR. But at a local level, even though, and I know Kevin Davis is here, and I admire a lot of what INN has done or trying to do, I don't see a lot of really effective collaboration at the local level. There's such angst, and there's so much chasing pennies rolling around on the floor that the time and mind space that it takes to make a collaboration effective, I just don't see it happening a lot out there.
So the downside of collaboration is?
I wouldn't say that it's downside so much as it's an extraordinary, I think people underestimate the challenge of it in terms of the time, effort, and energy that it takes to make it really effective. And again, I think that I haven't seen that translate nearly as well on the local level. On the local level where it has happened, I think what's called collaboration, from what I've seen, even at CIR and some other places, in many cases tends to be more a vendor-client relationship of, we'll put your work on our air, or we'll put your work in our newspaper, but it's not true collaboration.
Keith, I see some nodding. Are you in agreement, or are you pausing?
I'm in agreement. When I was at CBS, we tried to do a lot of collaborations, and it was challenging because a lot of folks would come to us and say, we've got this great story, it's running in 2 days, I should do it on the CBS Evening News. And that's not a collaboration. We want it to be in at the beginning and real partners on that stuff. So I found that sometimes, and again, this was sort of an evening news program which has its real constraints. It's harder to do those kind of collaborations for timing and all those things than I think there are in other places.
Yeah, I should add, I agree with that 100%, because when I talk about collaboration, I actually mean the editorial collaboration. I specifically mean that it's really a journalism collaboration that happens first. That's when it works.
Phil, you wanted to say something?
I was going to completely disagree until you just said that, because I do think that it starts with editorial. But I mean, CIR, and this is, I'm here as a proxy for our fearless executive director, Robert Rosenthal, who's out of town, who could articulate this much better than I ever will. But we have 300 partners we collaborate with. up to 300, obviously not all at once. But we have with Univision, as an example, a great partnership that starts with the product, with the editorial product, where we've already done one video piece, and we get the benefit of this great platform at Univision in Spanish. The translation, we get to spread it around because we are entirely inclusive and not at all exclusive in our partnerships and in our work. We have found those kind of relationships not to be just transactional. And we've spread out the notion of partnership to include Youth Speaks, which some people are very skeptical about. Youth Speaks, for those who don't know, is a spoken word organization of kids between 14 and 19. It's national, started here in the Bay Area. And we're looking for other platforms and other audiences. And of course, kids of in that age group feel not only removed from the news and what it is we all do very often, but feel victimized by it. So if you live in Oakland and you look at the press they call it, all these kids refer to it as the press. It's the press. We hate the press. It's all about murders. It's not about school issues. It's not about substantive issues in Oakland. So we collaborate, and some of them will be disasters, I can predict right now, and we'll try and move away from them as fast as we can in an entrepreneurial sensibility. But with Youth Speaks, the idea is we are injecting journalism, investigative journalism in particular, and real-time data and verified information into their process of performance art. So it goes from being a personal issue, you know, I have diabetes, my mom has diabetes, what do I do about it? Or I live in this culture of violence, what do we do about it? To here's some actual data that we, the Center for Investigative Reporting, have provided you, and you're going to inject that into your performance, and as just lucky as luck would have it, their performances are more powerful as a result of that. So whether they go on Showtime, whether they go on Univision, whether they go on stage in Oakland or San Francisco or Chicago, that's a collaboration that's fundamental and has as its goal attracting new audiences and doing it on new platforms. And so those partnerships for us are equally important as our partnerships with substantial news organizations and long-standing news organizations.
Mike, I saw a thought cloud.
Yeah, it really helps, I think, and I've experienced this over the years with Mr. Bergman and Mr. Engelberg and others, that collaborations, first of all, do have to be editorial driven. If they're just branding opportunities, they're not anything. But it also is extremely important to figure out who's bringing what to the table. What does each partner bring that the others don't have? If we, for example, did an investigation last year in the state of Pennsylvania into the size of the staff in the Pennsylvania legislature, which turns out to be, believe it or not, one of the most bloated legislative staffs in the country, but it was impossible to know that because there were no records, and at least no records that were ever made available, and of course the legislature exempted itself from freedom of information. So the only way to do this project was to count. Count every single member of the legislature. Now, that's a hell of a lot of work, except it happens that the AP has lots of members in Pennsylvania. So we organized a lot of newspapers around the state, and we asked each of them to count their members' staff. And then we did the arithmetic. And it was actually really simple, kind of like the speeding project in Florida. And there was something, everybody brought something very simple to the table. They brought their turf. Now, that's a really simple example, but you got to figure that out, and you got to figure it out going in. Steve?
Yeah, I will add one thing to this collaboration conversation. I turned to Rainey and I said, too bad Dean Baquet isn't here right now, but for those of you who remember a couple of years ago. But Dean had a legitimate point, which is that every collaboration does have a downside, despite all this campfire kumbaya stuff. When you collaborate, it certainly adds the editorial talents of the other side, which are often considered, but it also adds friction. And I think you have to, acknowledge, I think this is a very pro-collaboration crowd. We, not quite up to 300, but well over 150 separate partnerships at ProPublica, so we, like CIR, are great believers in this. But let's not kid ourselves. When you work with another news organization in different cultures, you get both their pluses, but also their minuses. And amazingly enough, there is more than one opinion on how to open a news story. And sometimes
within a single newspaper. I mean,
Yes.
Sometimes within a
working
single editor, Steve.
right.
right.
I mean,
There is friction, there can be waste of time, there can be disagreements, there are personalities, amazingly enough, at other news organizations that may not mesh perfectly with yours. So I think you have to analyze the cost-benefit and make sure that you're really getting something, as we often do, that is very, very much supplemental and not sort of just simply adding more friction.
Well, and there's one further point. When you're publishing something, the buck has to stop somewhere.
Yes.
Someone has to be ultimately responsible for saying this is being published. And that one individual institution holds a different responsibility from everybody else, which is a legal responsibility, responsibility to the ultimate product. And that's a thing that has to be worked out in a collaboration. Who's
Absolutely.
really holding that responsibility?
I was fascinated by the WikiLeaks collaboration where, the Guardian draws in the New York Times and says, you want a piece of this, and they were doing it in part for, to protect their flanks if the New York Times is charging into a story that gave them some cover. But you saw the two very different news organizations split that data apart in very different ways, different concentrations, and it was I guess it was a non-collaboration collaboration that was each piece stood as a kind of press critique of the other organization's work, saying no, you're wrong. This isn't what's important to the world. This is.
Jack, it's all about leverage. I think the collaborations. How do you leverage each piece of each partner's strength? So. It's not just, at CIR, as at other news organizations, we have learned painfully to start at the beginning and have everybody be part of the process. So while this may sound sacrilegious, we have our development people in the story meeting, so they know what projects we're working on and they can start their process. But we also have all the digital folks. We have a video operation, a very robust video operation. They're there from the beginning. Social media folks are there from the beginning. So everybody's there from the beginning. And if you take that concept and apply it as a grid to your relationships, then your collaborators are also part of that. We had I'm not going to talk about the shooter story for obvious reasons, but that collaboration with Esquire and CIR and ultimately other news organizations provided us not just with a story that got amplified out on various platforms, but provided us with, frankly, more fundraising possibilities.
What are the obvious reasons that you're not going to talk about that?
Well, because it was my story, so it just seems a little.
We have now met the first modest investigative reporter in the history of journalism. Steve, when ProPublica got started, an asshole press critic predicted that the organization would have a tough time keeping the meddling paws of its primary donor, Herb Sandler, out of the work. Herb, if you're here, please rattle your money so we can spot you. There he is. I was that asshole who made that prediction. So, Steve, can you tell me if it was much work keeping Herb out of your work? If he was easily discouraged? If he takes orders well?
Well,
does he agree to be rewritten by you?
Well, first of all, just to say that one of the first acts of the board of ProPublica was to pass a resolution saying that no board member would ever be allowed to know about a story in advance of publication. So literally when we have our gatherings and a reporter sometimes will see Herb and start describing their work, he will begin running away at full speed. So, I have to say it was not an act of great sort of editorial courage here. You're not looking at some buccaneering editor who's fought off the evil money men with a sword. The relationship with Herb, I kind of smile when you say that. I was reminded of a moment when I worked for Joe Lilleveld, the executive editor of the New York Times, who was constantly wandering out past my desk, which happened to be the first desk he saw when he left his office. That's, by the way, the worst seat in any newsroom is the desk out, because he comes out of his office furious about something, and the first person is me, right? And I was doing editorial, investigative projects with no staff, so I wasn't the guy that could solve any of his problems. And he would suggest ideas, and most of them were never done. And he would say, I have a story idea. I know you're not going to do this, but could you please? So, Herb is a great reader of the news, and after, I think, 4 years of ProPublica, he would constantly suggests story ideas, and we never do them, and he never gets mad. And finally, one day, he suggested one, and lo and behold, it became our investigation of the X-ray sort of and radiation problems with TSA scanners. And Herb, it turned out to be a real big story. So, you know,
Keep it up, kid. You got a future in this business.
which means that you're, which means your batting averages are right around Lilleveld's. But anyway, so, you know, I mean, Joe's ideas were good, but you know, as Mike can tell you, we all had our own little things to run, and we all felt we knew what we needed to do. So, no, I don't think it's been a terribly difficult thing. I think the more sort of interesting and complex dance in nonprofit journalism is the ongoing conversation between us and funders. I think there is certainly a lot more knowledge today than there was 5 years ago on both sides of how the two worlds work. But you know, that thing that I raised in the last panel, which is you're doing investigative reporting and you don't know where you're going, is fundamentally tricky when you're raising money for a project, because if you're honest about it, you say we'd like to look in this area and we have this idea, but we could end up 180 degrees different. And I think that's still something that the foundation world is sort of coming to grips with the oddities of the investigative world.
If I could speak to that, I mean, even in the for-profit or aspirational for-profit world, we're looking to foundations for funding now. We're actually in a negotiation right now about a grant that would come from the Gates Foundation and actually laundered through another nonprofit before it gets to us. But one of the real challenges is they want to know, Gates wants to know, what's the outcome going to be? You know, they want the promises of outcome going in, which is, again, not the way we work. We do think about impact, and we certainly are aspirational in that regard, too. I mean, as we choose what we want to work on, we have visions of what the outcome might be, but I can't give them those assurances like they're used to having with other things.
That's interesting, because Gates, you know, we just got a small grant from Gates to create a business plan, in essence, around the notion of how do you measure, what is impact, how do you measure it. This has consequences, obviously, far beyond the world of journalism, but we were happy to try and have it apply to journalism first, particularly with the ability Gates has to provide funding. But it seems like it's a very different project, and maybe slightly at cross purposes. If they want, in your case, impact in advance, or no impact in advance, and in our case, they're looking for what the formula is to measure that. It seems like maybe we're talking to different people in the Gates Foundation.
Well, I think there may be answers in how we can come together on that and help them understand.
It's collaboration.
I'm not sure how that's different than it's ever been, though, with, you know, anytime you're pitching an investigative story in the for-profit world, the editor wants to know, well, what the hell are you going to get out of this? And you're going to go off and do this for 6 months, and to me, it's the exact same question. What are you going to wind up with? Well, we might wind up with this. We might wind up with something else.
But he's not asking for a metrics matrix.
They're not looking at, no, they're not looking for a metrics, but they're certainly looking for where you're going to end up and what's your outcome going to be.
But they are looking for metrics. The Gates Foundation commissioned a white paper from Dick Toffel, and everybody should go and where's it posted, Dick? At ProPublica. And they, correct me if I'm wrong, Dick, but the Gates Foundation basically put the question to you, how is impact measured in journalism? And that the Gates make, how do you think of it? And the Gates Foundation across the board, journalism and tiddlywinks and polio eradication, they want to get out the micrometer and the mass spectrometer and measure everything. And you know, there's some resistance by journalists to this notion that impact can be measured, that these things are quantifiable, that they're not actually outside of the capacity of someone to measure. Do we have any reflections on that? I mean, you're tainted because you've taken the Gates money. You've got to be for quantification now.
Yes, I'm proud of it. So, no, I mean, the money we've taken is to determine whether there is a methodology or whether we can put together a project that would successfully measure and answer the question that was asked of Dick also. I just feel that, that we are a little too shy at times about talking about impact. I know that Steve and Dick and ProPublica, you know, have, I think, as part of their charter that we want to do stories that make a difference.
Sure.
And we have, being on the West Coast, a slightly different saying, which is see if shit happens as a result of the story. You know, I'm not, William Randolph Hearst, not to raise the name here in this august crowd, but, you know, he had something called journalism of action. in the turn of the last century. And for him, it meant, you know, invading Cuba and breaking people out of jail there. We have a slightly more modest view about journalism of action, which is if you're gonna compel people to feel strongly about something because you write a compelling story or broadcast a compelling story, then you should maybe provide them with at least some options and opportunities, help direct them towards solutions that they want to engage in. You shouldn't be telling them what to think, but you can help them along in the process after your story's done. You don't simply walk away and wait for the next story. And that's kind of the area we're experimenting with. It does have to do with impact.
I think part of the problem is that the way non-journalistic organizations, particularly foundations, define impact is different from the impact that we should be seeking. We all believe in the impact of having people more engaged and more knowledgeable about issues that matter. What we don't believe in is that we shouldn't decide in advance what the outcome should be. That's not our job to make that decision. I'll give you an example in real life. Everybody in this room, I think, knows about the work we did on the New York Police Department. Eileen was here earlier in the forum. Well, it wasn't for us to decide how the citizens of New York should react to that information, to the information that the police department was spying on one of its communities. It was our job to let the city know that was happening. And we did that. And I think that's a valuable impact. And if we were in the business of taking foundation money for that kind of work, I would have argued that's the service you're supporting. But it isn't for us to measure impact in policy outcomes. That's actually not journalistic. And that's what a lot of foundations, I think, sometimes do. And I guess we just have to school them on the difference.
It's not AP journalistic, but there are many, there's lots of advocacy journalism that's done very well, that is done to move people to take action, right, or be an action in itself.
Understood. And that's fine if that's what they're explicitly doing.
But if I'm a customer of yours, I'm a consumer of your product, and your story has moved me to great outrage, right, and I want to know what to do about it, are you going to help me get there?
We'll write a lot about what the possibilities are and what choices might be and what options are, but we won't recommend what the option should be. And
right, but that's telling people what to think. I'm more in the you're going to help people, guide people to where they want to go. So if you write something about the abortion issue, you know, are you going to have, very simply speaking, links to different organizations that are advocacy organizations?
We might.
You know, one of the interesting things about working with Univision and going there from where I've been for 20 years is Univision really sees itself as an advocate for its audience and isn't afraid to be an advocate for its audience. And so on immigration, Jorge Ramos is not afraid to speak to what he knows the audience is important to the audience. Jorge Ramos is an advocate for immigration reform, unapologetically. And you know, he will do that in his reporting. Everyone knows it. It's transparent. It's not hidden, and he's not reluctant to do that.
And in the 1890s in New York, Hearst and Pulitzer were the same kind of advocates for, you know, the impoverished and the immigrant populations and the underrepresented, and they were advocacy journalists. If you're out of work or you want to change jobs, the Gates Foundation posted a job this week to basically be, Dick, would it be right to say head quantifier or spear chucker of the quantification movement?
I'm not sure spear chucker was in the description, but yes.
When we get it to rewrite.
Somebody who worked for the person who was actually both David's grant officer and Phil's grant officer to help them quantify impact. Yes.
So, you know, I sense right now I might have to split because I sense a press column coming on. If Gates sort of starts to move money in like this, it could change as it goes through the money laundry. I could get some columns out of this, so it's good for me. Keith, what bar did you close last night, and who did you go home with? Because when I saw him leave,
you don't know, Jack.
When I saw him leaving this place, he was exhausted but invigorated at the same time.
Kind of like being on this panel.
So you're at Univision now. You're starting from a sort of a clean slate, a blank slate. Tell us what that's like to Imagine Investigations and a brand new organization, you know, the seed's been planted, the shoot's
Well,
coming
you know,
up.
here's the thing. It turns out it's actually not a brand new organization. Univision has been around for a long time. I believe Jorge Ramos and Maria Elena Salinas have anchored longer than, what was that guy's name, Cronkite? And they've been there for a very long time. Since Isaac Lee has been there in the last couple of years, he's reinvigorated it. He's created an investigative unit with Gerardo Reyes and a great team. He's created a documentary unit. And they are doing a lot of great investigative work. The cool thing that we're also doing that's kind of fun is we're creating a new channel in partnership with ABC. And that will be focusing on English-speaking young Hispanics. By the way, there's 5 job postings for an investigative team for that channel, if anyone's looking as well. So there is a growing interest in these organizations in doing enterprise reporting, investigative reporting. And so, you know, it's for me, coming from the world that I've always come from, to work with journalists who have put their lives on the line to do the kind of reporting that you do in Latin America is really invigorating. And they're bringing, I think, into sort of the world that I've always been in and many of us have operated in, a whole new sensibility and a whole new sense of, a whole new area of skills and strengths that I've just never experienced before.
So tell me about how that sensibility is going to drive something new, because it's brand new.
You know, I think what you know, Gerardo and his team did last year on the Fast and Furious is a perfect example. You know, when I was at CBS and working with Cheryl Atkinson, she did a lot of reporting about the ATF program to get guns across the border. But a lot of the Anglo reporting on that story focused on, well, who knew? Did Holder know? When did Holder know? Did Holder get this memo? Did Holder get that memo? And there was a year of reporting on that. And what the folks at Univision brought to it was a very different perspective. They said, where the fuck did these guns go? Who died with these guns? What happened, not in Washington, but what happened in Mexico when the guns got there? And they were able to look at it from a very different perspective and bring, I think, a whole new series of questions. And they found, actually, it was at this party where these children were murdered that some of these guns were found. And they were able to put names on it. And nobody in the English language press had done that. It was exciting because when we did the broadcast, we simulcast it with you know, closed captioning in English. They just won a Peabody for that, which we're very proud of. So that, to me, they bring a different sensibility, different ideas about how to cover something that's going on here, there. And to me, that's the exciting part about being there.
And just to touch the base one more time, in your startup mode, are you anticipating collaborations?
Yes, we desperately want to do collaborations. The advantage of and you know, unlike, I think, what I experienced at CBS, the advantage of being at Univision right now is collaborations work really well when you're working with somebody with a very different audience. So, you know, a Time magazine and CBS News, kind of the same audience. But people are very eager to say, this is a whole new world, a very different audience to work with. So we have that opportunity, and we've been able to develop some good stuff with various groups on collaborations. The other thing that's going to be interesting is we have 2 news organizations, Univision and ABC, both that have, you know, strong, well-funded investigative teams, creating a new channel that will also have an investigative team. Those 3 audiences are very different, and you have those 3 organizations all now in partnership with each other. So we're excited to see how you have 3 investigative teams at for-profit broadcast and cable companies being able to come together and do different types of stuff. Yes, I'm optimistic. Sorry about that.
We'll beat that out of him.
Thanks.
Rainey, at Frontline, you've been expanding your web presence with addendums, annotations, original work, and you've commented to me that you think broadcasting is where newspapers were 3-7 years ago in terms of shrinking and downsizing. So tell me about how Frontline's navigating this journalistic sea change and how it's changing the investigative work you do.
So, I mean, I think the most encouraging piece of it is that we've been studying our audience really for the first time, genuinely looking at who they are. And what we see is we actually have a really young audience that goes on our broadcast for PBS, right? So they're in their mid-50s, which I don't think is a bad thing, by the way. I really don't. I think a mid-50s audience is great for broadcast. Actually,
well, look at me when you say that.
I'm just looking at you because,
Thank you.
I'm playing to you.
All right.
No, but in all seriousness, we have the youngest audience on PBS, which is a huge boon for us as a broadcast, and the broadcast is growing. That said, of course, the cord cutting that's happening is huge. We're here now looking at a huge amount of people already cord cutting, meaning they're watching us on demand. So our biggest challenge is to make sure that Frontline is a brand and is a show that you want to seek out, that you don't just stumble across. So we're looking carefully at who's our dedicated audience, who's our passionate audience. We find that online, and you can actually relate to them better. So why I'm encouraged is when we look at the people coming to us online, those numbers are up by 60 to 70% in the last year and a half. And the reason is because we relaunched our website about a year and a half ago with a totally new mandate, which is to say we used to be a film anthology website. We're very proud of those deep content websites. But now what we are is we do those, but we've added a digital team that's producing and writing constantly. So they're publishing 3 or 4 times a day, serious stuff. They're pointing to films from the past, going to films in the future. The question about accountability journalism, they don't just jump off as soon as we have a film. They continue to cover it. If you look at a film like The Untouchables and what that did after Lanny Brewer stepped down, the rip-roaring effect of that film and the conversation we continue to publish and write about, and that really builds an audience.
So how does it change your work? This
Well,
sort
the
of like this sort of
metabolism
pivoting.
is totally different.
The what?
The metabolism of Frontline is totally different. I think David would agree. He knows better than anyone. He always says that and he groans. But I think it's true that we are publishing, we're hungrier, we're more entrepreneurial, and we don't just assume that the broadcast goes out and then you say, okay, we're done with that. We're done with that topic for the next 4 or 5 years. So it's a different environment. It's totally different. And I should say online, the audience is the inverse as the broadcast. So online, our audience are primarily like 70 to 75% are younger than the age of 49. They're deeply committed. That's very exciting. I mean, a younger audience is coming to us online saying, we care about this stuff, we want to read it, we want to watch it, and they're watching for long stretches of time.
Mike?
Priscilla Payton said something very important in the last panel, and it directs straight into what Rennie's talking about. She talked about how there's an appetite out there for the kind of work everybody in this room believes in. And she talked about how this appetite was actually so strong that she was quite surprised by it. Now think about that for a second. This is Priscilla Payton, a longtime journalist who's also learned to be one of the great book publishers in our business. And she's not just, what she's describing is not just a book phenomenon. There are a lot of people who are interested in work that reveals things to them, that helps them understand the world better.
Right.
The challenge, and this is what Priscilla was describing, and it's what Rainey is describing, is figuring out how to put the material together in ways that reach them.
Right, and that's a
the
huge
challenge.
game changer. So one of the things, I mean, Frontline used to be a film that would show up on Tuesday night, and God bless those films, they're amazing. I think the biggest change that we did, and again, it goes back to Law and Disorder and some other films, where we started to crack off pieces of our journalism ahead of time. We started to say, it's okay, we don't need to sort of like protect everything until that Tuesday night. We can put it out there. We can say, hey, come and look at us in short form. Come and look at the pictures that we got exclusively to bring people through the door. I mean, it's back to this distribution question and basically being more aggressive and not just sort of sitting back and saying everybody's going to come and see you because you're a blockbuster broadcast. So that really changes the nature of how we do things. I mean, it really does.
It's one of the things we're looking at with this new channel with Fusion for young Hispanics. Turns out the people we're trying to get to watch this channel don't actually watch TV. So
They don't watch TV, right?
Right. And if they do, they turn it on at 8 o'clock at night. So I suspect that what we're going to find out with Fusion is that people will, of course, watch TV, but the content and the storytelling, and we're finding a great interest in accountability journalism, whatever you want to call it, enterprise reporting, is that we're going to be delivering this on phones and on the web. Young Hispanics oversample on mobile devices, on smartphones. We need to figure out how to deliver the enterprise content in a way that they're going to consume it in those places. They want it. They really want it. It's just, it's like we keep saying we want to deliver the milk to the door, and they're like, no, we want to come to the market and get it. We just need to figure out how to get it to them where they are.
Just based on what Michael was talking about, I would draw people's attention, if you haven't seen it, to the iFiles, which is something that CIR, what's the word? We don't create it all, but we are the aggregators. We are the aggregators. Thank you. I hate those words, but that's what we do. And we started in August of last year, and we have 2 million views, and we have partnerships with a lot of people, including people at this table, organizations represented by the people at this table, and people are staying on those videos for 5 minutes, which, if you think about it in the YouTube world, is an extraordinary amount of time. And so I think, just to back up what Michael was saying, I think that there is a hunger. What we're finding, and I'm sure that Steve and ProPublica and other organizations are finding, is that people are coming to us more and more and more saying, like, we can't do this stuff anymore, but our audience wants it. Okay? It was kind of like the YouTube shift, and Dave is here from Google in the back, who helped us start iFiles. I mean, YouTube, it was cats falling off roofs. And boy, that was a huge audience, but they found that it wasn't a very sticky audience, or whatever word you want to use, for an audience that's stuck with you. So you could maybe make money off it in the future. And then they sort of decided, well, no, maybe there is something to this substance thing. I remember market researchers, when I was still at the Chronicle, coming and telling us, consultants are there to tell you need more consulting, and that's what they were there to do. But I remember one of these guys from this marketing organization, while they were giving their presentation, leaned to me and he said, "Substance is back."
Actually,
and so again, not to get more to this kumbaya thing, because if you ask me what my criticisms are of this whole thing, I can tell you those too. But I do think that there is this moment, and I don't think we can run fast enough to capture that moment where people are interested and they're not getting it in all the other places. I watched Howie Kurtz this morning. I'm sorry I should have been here, but he spent 20% of his show talking about a congressman who tweeted to Cyndi Lauper that she was hot, and that created we're not going to get that respect, and we're not going to get that attention in sort of the mainstream media in that sense, but the audience is interested.
Phil was lying about not being into Kumbaya. He'll be available for a hug after the session to anybody who wants one. Steve, you wanted?
Well, just to follow up on your no whinging thing, because over the years, the Logan Symposium has sort of traced the deep depression in the sort of psyches of all of us, and I think there is a kind of an upswell. I was just trying to write down all of the sort of positive things, some of which represented right here in this panel, about what's happening in investigative reporting. Al Jazeera stepping in and really spending serious money and setting out to do excellent work. What Keith is doing. You see in these universities, if you live up in Boston, you have a Robbie Robinson, one of the finest investigative editors and reporters I've ever seen, running a program at a university and placing front page stories, the Boston Globe, what Lowell does here. I think that you can't underestimate what's happened to the business. The jobs have been cut, and yes, for everything I've just said, you can come up with 2 or 3 counterexamples, but I think there is a hunger for this content. Content is back. And I think there's also a realization at the level of regional newspapers. David can speak to this because, frankly, he invented it before there was a crisis, which was the notion that if you run a regional newspaper, you need to present things people can't get anywhere else. I think the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel and the Seattle Times are models for what regional newspapers, if they can succeed and survive, are going to look like, and that's a pretty good model. So I think if the glass is certainly not full, but it's not as empty as it was a few years ago.
But that's totally dependent on the initiative of the publisher. Without the publisher owner prioritizing that and thinking that that's important, that's even when newspapers were 30% margin businesses. A lot of them, like Gannett, would just pocket the profits and go buy another newspaper and pocket those profits. And so, I think that at the risk of whinging, it really does depend on ownership.
But it always has, right?
Right,
Hasn't
right.
it?
That's what I'm
I
saying.
remember Lowell telling his great story last year that when he started working at the paper, he went to the newsroom and nobody, where is everybody? They're all at the bar. That wasn't a heyday of investigative reporting. And now we go to the journalism conferences where every year there's more and more people complaining about the death of investigative reporting. There were 1,200 people at IRE last year complaining about the death of investigative reporting. There were 800 the year before. It's hard. I know we like to be skeptical and think we're dying.
They need a lot of pallbearers to drag out the dead body.
Yes, we do.
Steve?
I was going to say, you're right about the publisher being sort of the wellspring of this, but I think there is an argument to be made that there is now a commercial incentive or imperative to do this kind of work. That if you look at your options regionally, not nationally, but regionally, yes, 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 you have to be first with the city council meeting and the big fire and so on. But if anybody's going to come read you, it has to be because you're giving them something they can't get anywhere else. So I think there's actually a commercial reason to invest in this.
Yeah, I'd like to build on that. I mean, we used to, most of the people on this panel would repeatedly say for many years at conferences, well, good journalism is good business. The fact is that we were lying at that time. Good journalism was not particularly good business. The best business was in the mediocre outlets. But that is changing now. And even the Gannett's are realizing that and starting to build investigative teams. And the way that cycle, I think and believe and hope is going to work in the for-profit side of things is that you will build content that people can't get anywhere else. A lot of it public service, meaningful content that they're hungry for and that will have an impact. They will pay for it in whatever format. I have to say we started a digital subscription model, very much like the New York Times, is 3 weeks ago, and the absorption rate at this point is like twice as fast as we thought it was going to be, which is optimistic. That in and of itself is not going to provide enough income, but from that, what we then can learn and know about the people who are reading us online, and presumably the degree to which we can target advertising to them, I'm optimistic there's a business model in there somewhere.
Yeah.
We've got to get from here to there.
Yeah, in a world awash with information, like cats falling off roofs, it's a survival technique to stand out, to do something that matters more. And sometimes that'll just be, why is the cat falling off the roof? But other times it can be the kind of special stuff that people in this room believe in.
Who threw the cat off the roof?
Exactly so.
Well, you know, Jack,
Bill Bronstein.
can we talk, I threw the cat off the roof?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Can we talk about the dirty S word, which David alludes to, which is sustainability? You know, we're experimenting a lot, and Dave's Boardman's point earlier about local being very difficult. I mean, CIR, we love local so much, we merged with a local news organization, Bay Citizen, because we felt, first of all, there's value in local reporting, but there's value in local reporting that translates to regional, state, national, and even international. So we have Mimi Shakarova, who did a fabulous documentary called The Price of Sex, about sex trafficking, where she went back to Eastern Europe, where she's from, and then went to Turkey and Greece and all these areas where women are trafficked. But that translates down to the street corner in Oakland, where women from Eastern Europe are actually being peddled. And the same is true of Aaron Glance's great work on veterans was mentioned earlier. That started with the Oakland VA hospital and the wait times. And then we did interactive maps and all that, you know, we do graphic illustrations, we do every form that seems reasonable to get people involved in the story. But there is a local component, and the local component can extend beyond local to national and international. And that's the experiment that I think is one of the most interesting that we're doing at CIR.
This question for both Steve and Phil. Both you guys have worked in for-profit newspapers for a long, long time. You've earned your bones in investigations. You're in this new creature of the nonprofit supported by philanthropy. How has that changed your view of investigative journalism? You want to take that first, Steve?
Well, you know, I would say actually not as much as I expected it to. I think that fortunately so far in terms of the thing that Phil is raising, sustainability, we have been fortunate to be able to go out and raise enough money to continue to do what we do. So no, I mean, I actually think, you know, the biggest change for me, very honestly, was that in moving from a sort of purely sort of newspaper setting, we present the facts, people react to them, as Mike describes, into an organization that's trying to do journalism that generates change through journalism. You know, that has been a little bit of a paradigm shift for me to sort of think about, okay, how can we, in this very busy world, do a story that gets the attention of people to the point where they might be moved to anger? And I think it's brought a sharpness and a specificity to the work that maybe I didn't quite have before, where I felt essentially, we'll put it out there and, you know, then they'll have to decide what to do with it. But I don't think it's changed that much.
Phil?
I guess I've learned the value of begging. I think that, you know, I never expected in my career, as checkered as it is, to end up being a fundraiser. But I am a fundraiser, and that's how I spend most of my time, and that's how I ought to spend most of my time. And so I think that whole world has opened up to me. But what that has also opened up to me is the notion, you know, Herb Sandler's here, and he's a great example, but we have a guy who's in his 40s, who's got a $10 billion fund, hedge fund, a local guy who's our vice chair, who gave us $2.25 million at the time we merged with the Bay Citizen, stretched out over 3 years. He's a guy you would never find at one of these conferences normally. He's not even an observer of this world in a visible way, but he's a guy who's totally committed to what it is that CIR is doing and to the notion of investigative reporting. He shows up for board meetings, he shows up at our events, he steps forward, and there's a whole group of people out there like this guy, and maybe even younger, where, you know, you can engage them and have them be part of your, you know, kumbaya community by participating in these things, and them feeling like they're participating in the greater world outside of their narrow vision of hedge funds and finances. And so discovering that those people exist, I think, has been inspirational for me and transformational in terms of how I approach what I do.
I have one more question. I would like all the panelists to take a swing at it, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. If you could press a button and go back 30 years, when newspapers were earning 30% margins, they could afford big staffs, investigative units, were large, well-funded, or stay here where your staffs are smaller, resources are fewer, but you have all the technological tools that, you know, are now at our disposal that we couldn't even imagine 30 years ago. Would you press the button? Mike, you want to take that first?
I would not. First of all, I can, but even pretend
You wouldn't
I
go
could.
back.
But I wouldn't, and here's why I wouldn't go back. There was great journalism produced 30 years ago, but there was also a lot of crap produced 30 years ago. And the truth is that the old business model allowed us to get away with murder. It wasn't our journalism that was selling those newspapers. It was the comics and the ads and the sports section. God bless sports. I'm a big sports fan. And we're in a different world now where actually each piece of journalism stands much more on its own than it used to. And that's been pretty painful, and it's been pretty difficult. But I think in the long run, it's making us all a lot better. I think it's already better, and I think it's going to get a lot better. So I say forward.
Phil, button?
I used to refer to old journalism as the higher calling disease, because we all felt we had a higher calling, and we didn't really want to get involved with that icky, messy public thing. So, you know, the apocryphal story I tell is the reporter who's, you know, busy working on his or her story, and someone says, hey, there's a reader on the line. It's like, I'm too busy doing journalism to talk to a reader. That, of course, never happened, but I imagined it happening day in and day out 30 years ago, because we didn't really need to care. As Mike said, we didn't really need to care. And so suddenly we now are forced to, because the public has the tools to interject itself in everything that we do. And if we don't get ahead of that and use that as leverage to do what we do, you know, I think we're making a mistake. So what the last 30 years has forced us to do is understand that there's an audience out there. We don't know the extent of the audience, but we know it's probably bigger than the one we have. And we have to figure out a way to reach them, and they're going to reach us. And so I think paying attention to the public has been the value of the last painful 30 years.
Keith should disqualify himself from answering the question because he has a time machine and he frequently goes back 30 years ago. He doesn't need the button, but I'll let him.
No way in hell do we want to go back. Are you kidding? I mean, I can't imagine that there is more great investigative reporting happening now than there was 30 years ago. I mean, I can't believe we would even consider that. This is a golden age. There are more outlets, there are more voices, there are more people. It's not in the places that we saw it 30 years ago. And I think we sometimes confuse because it wasn't happening in the same places, it wasn't happening. But there's more going on now, and it's only going to get better.
David?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think I'm guessing we're all going to say the same thing in terms of not going back 30 years. The only way I'd go back 30 years is if I could also know exactly what I know now, know what the tools are going to be, and maybe we as a profession could have, and an industry could have made some smarter decisions along the way. I do think now, I mean, even just thinking about the technology, you know, the availability of data, the availability, the ability to take local, national because of that availability of data, the multimedia tools, the ability to crowdsource. And I think this point that Phil made, our connection with the community. We have, in our major news planning meeting every week, we have something we call the community chair. We bring somebody in from the community. It might be the CEO of Alaska Airlines, or we might walk down and pull 3 people out of the Occupy Seattle protest because they don't have leaders, just 3 people. And what we do is in the first half of the news meeting, we invite them to participate in all our planning and see how the sausage is made. Second half, we turn it over to them. And what are we missing? What should we be doing differently? What are the great stories out there that we might not know about? And it's been an incredible asset to us that we wouldn't have even considered doing 10 years ago, let alone 30.
Rainey?
Did you talk to David? Does everyone know this is our 30th year? This 30th year, right? No, I mean, the nostalgic part of me, I've been listening to all these great stories from 30 years ago because Mike Kirk, David Fanning, all these guys are telling these amazing stories of starting up Frontline. So I would love to just go back and glance at these people who founded Frontline. And then I came along 12 years ago, right, to produce and work for Frontline. But I will say, if you look at documentary film and you look at the renaissance in the affordability of equipment, if you look at the way that you can just pick up a camera, you can go for it, anyone can do this now, and you think hard about what the future looks like for documentary film, it's a renaissance for us right now. In particular, for what we do, it is ever changing. I think one thing that hasn't come up today is, I think if tablets hadn't come along and we were still working simply on the web and we were thinking about how do you actually reach an audience with long-form documentary film on the web, I'd be more concerned. But I think the tablet, iPad, I think those are game changers. People are leaning back, they're watching for longer. So I'll stay here, but boy, I'd love to visit back then, just to like have checked it out.
Steve?
There's too much agreement here, Jack.
Well,
You
come
know,
on, say no, say no.
these people have ruined my reputation.
Yeah. Well, okay. First of all, I think my fellow panelists have offered really good rationales for staying here, and I wouldn't disagree with any of them. I personally would like to take myself back 30 years so I could be 25 but live in this era. That's my game plan.
That would be cool.
And I will say, as somebody who still does some reporting now and again when I can sneak it in, the technology that exists today, I think, is so remarkable. I mean, when I think about when Mike and I came up at the New York Times Washington Bureau in the 80s, you could spend a week finding a single former government employee. I once did this. I tracked down a CIA official in Miami who had been working in El Salvador. It took me a full week. I had to get voting records. I reversed phone books, These words mean nothing to young people in the room. Anyway.
Oh, that's where you were.
And I finally get him on the phone and I say, I'm Steve Engelberg from the New York Times. And the guy says, I cannot believe that you have found me. I cannot believe it. And I said, but I did. Isn't that great? And I'd like to do an interview. He said, I can't talk about any of that stuff. It's all classified. And I said, but I took a week to find you. Don't you? He said, you're a great reporter and good luck with the next guy. Yeah. So the ability to go into LinkedIn and sweep up 100 names of people who work at a company, the ability to use big data, the ability to operate as we now do, to do a radio story, a video component, audio. ProPublica now has 6 music videos. We have a whole disc of music videos we have done. No, I would never go back except to be 25 again.
Right.
Now, of course,
I'd
Dave Boardman does raise one good point. If we could go back 30 years and invent Google before you guys at Google invented Google, that would save a lot of stress.
I want to add one point on the data front. We should not take for granted what's available, and I'm really concerned that we may be, and particularly at the state and local level. Just this week, I was in our state capital and learned that there's a movement afoot to make certain sorts of what are now readily available electronic data available only by going down to the courthouse and getting the piece of paper again. These guys, it's a chess game with local and state government, particularly right now, and they're trying to stay a step ahead of us. We can't take that for granted.
I would just, Jack, urge, Dave, I think has a very good practice in inviting community members in to the paper. I would just urge all of us to invite ourselves out, because I think that's, that's really the whole, look, come into our house is a great welcoming thing to do to the public, but life is happening. As we know, as reporters, we go out to get it. Sorry.
So let's open it up to questions.
Hi, I'm Oriana Zill from 60 Minutes and have worked with many of the people on the panel. And I wanted to ask about advertising on your websites and whether that's a reliable revenue stream in the future and what has changed.
Anybody want to take that?
Want to take that? Yeah.
Well, I referred a bit to this earlier. I mean, I think as an industry, we're finding that banner display ads on websites are not particularly effective as an income stream. You know, it's a matter of supply and demand. There's far too much supply for the demand, and so much of that is sold at so-called remnant rates on news sites. I think the key, and what I'm optimistic about, is as we get people to subscribe to our digital content, then we will know much more about them, where they live, what their interests are, and we can target advertising directly to them, which serves the needs of the advertisers, presumably the readers, and certainly us.
Right there, as long as the microphone's closed.
Hi, Dave Washburn with Voice of OC. I'd like to touch on a subject that both David and Phil talked about, which is the local collaborations. I mean, we do see a lot of collaboration at the higher level, one resource-rich organization collaborating with another resource-rich collaboration. And the reason that works is because the collaboration, in addition to the journalism, the collaboration needs to be managed. And so you guys have the ability to do that. At the local level, what happens, well, first of all, it's very hyper-competitive at the local level, so just the idea of collaboration is still more difficult to conceive of. The other problem is there's nobody to manage the collaboration. And so there's, you get a couple reporters saying, oh, that'd be a good story, we should do it together, but then it's too hard just to get the story going, let alone manage some kind of collaboration. So that is an issue. I think there's a few things that are going on. In Southern California, we had some success with the Reporting on Health Collaborative, where we did some work with on the issue of valley fever, and there were newspapers and websites up and down the state working on stuff. I think there needs to be, from our perspective, a greater emphasis from you guys on a kind of a big brother concept, big sister concept, as far as, if you want to keep investigative reporting strong and you believe that it needs, at the grassroots level, it needs to be strong, I think you need to open your platforms up a little bit to our work and our content. We're told often that we don't have a content problem, but we have a distribution problem. And I think that with some help from the CIRs of the world, the ProPublicas of the world, and even the LA Timeses of the world, if we ever figure out what they're doing.
Is there a question? There's a question.
There's no
at the
question.
end of
It's a
this?
statement.
Okay.
It's a statement. And so
All
I
right.
just
Wait.
asked.
Can I just say one quick thing about that? I just wanted to ask you guys this too. I think it's a really interesting model that we've done a few times is national local. Like we just did this film called Raising Adam Lanza, and we frankly worked with the Hartford Courant because they were doing the best journalism about Adam Lanza. We just swooped in there. And we worked with a couple of reporters there, and they were terrific. And they actually were able to gain access. We did it with the Times-Picayune on law and disorder. So that's another model, is really an active partnership with local reporters who oftentimes have better sources than national reporters.
The other thing I think that's helpful, I mean, we've talked about collaboration, and Phil, I think, rightly said right at the outset that if you're going to do a project together, you need to work together from the outset. That's true. But there are other forms of collaboration. At ProPublica, we have done a lot of national databases, our Dollars for Docs database, things like that, where then literally hundreds of local organizations have gone out and used our data work to create very, very good local stories that we could never have done. And we don't supervise that, we don't direct it, we just delight in it. And I think that that is a different kind of collaborative model where a national organization is putting out the key material you need to do something locally, and then off you go. And I think we've seen some huge success with that.
We do have a team, by the way, at CIR. Is Megan here? Megan Farnsworth? There in the back. She is in charge. She's the person you're talking about who organizes our collaborations, local and beyond. So we are aware of the fact that our local partners can't always have that person. We do have that person. In fact, we have a team to do it. Now, what you end up doing is sacrificing some spaces. So we have people who deal with social and collaboration. We don't have a reporter in that slot.
Up here, right here.
Hi, I have two questions. The first question is directed at David Boardman. I come from a nonprofit model, and I'm interested in your Gates thing that's going on. I have 2 questions on that, but then a separate question to the rest of the folks.
Wait a minute. One question.
There's only 2 questions.
One question, come on.
Oh, okay.
1 2-part question.
Okay. Well, the second question is really what do freelancers do with your organizations, but we'll talk about that later. Did Gates approach you? Did you approach Gates? And are other newspapers doing this? I mean, that's our competition in public broadcast,
Right.
and I'm fascinated that now that newspapers are going to nonprofit funders.
We actually have, we have 2 existing foundation grants right now. One is a local foundation that's called the Seattle International Foundation, and they actually approached us because they wanted to see more foreign, Seattle-focused, Northwest-focused foreign reporting in our newspaper. And they actually pay for all of our foreign travel. It's spectacular, yeah. And that's a small family-run foundation. They approached us. We have another one right now from the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting that we're working on a global project on ocean acidification. The Gates has been more of a dance, really, over time. I mean, they came under a lot of criticism in the Northwest for focusing only globally and nationally and not locally, and they started a local division. We were talking with them about various things we might do, and we've settled on something that's a tremendous area of interest for us locally and an interest for them nationally. And then we brought in a third party that has an approach to this that intrigues both of us. So it's been more of a dance than one or the other. And we haven't nailed it down yet, so don't do anything to mess it up.
A question about how the delivery device is changing how you structure your work. I mean, the notion of reading investigative projects of the length that would run in the New York Times on an iPhone is daunting, to say the least. And I have wondered for years when we were going to recognize that these massively long word counts and these little bitty devices were not a match made in heaven. So how is the way you do, particularly Mike and Steve and people who are, and David, who are in the print legacy sort of area, are you writing tighter, shorter? Are you using hyperlinks? Are you writing on multiple levels? How are you structuring these projects so that they can be adequately and creatively consumed on the kind of devices that you're delivering
This
them
is
on?
a big and important question. You want to start, Steve?
No, go ahead, Mike.
Steve and I have been fumbling through this question for more than 20 years now.
Yep.
So the first thing is stop thinking about writing. It's not just about writing. It's about taking a body of journalism and figuring out different ways to present it. And importantly now, it's about numbers. And it's about presentation of data. It's about interactives on the web. You can do an enormous amount of great journalism before you write one word. You can present a lot of material. And what we haven't yet really mastered is the art of letting go of part of those long text stories and realizing that it's being presented in other ways and the text part of it's actually smaller. And you can already see how that's going to work. And the Times Avalanche project was experimental in a sense at showing some of that, although they ended up writing the story at the full length anyway, or more possibly. So, but, you know, we often do stories, and it's, I mean, it is the AP. We can run 3,000 words, but we can also run 700 words, but marry it to an interactive graphic that in fact contains more information than the original version of a 3,000-word story. And you got to think that way.
I don't, in all honesty, think we've mastered this yet. I think that, as Rainey said, the tablet is a wonderful moment because it allows us to do long form in a comparable way. I think the phone remains very much a work in progress. We have experimented with taking stories and boiling them down to 6, 8 sentences and then say, click here if you want more. But once you go to the want more, yes, you have this collision of thousands of words in an iPhone. So I don't necessarily think we've mastered it. But what I would say is that with this explosion of forms, you can do things where maybe you don't have to win on the iPhone because there are other ways to get the story. The piece we did on Magnetar, this hedge fund in 2010, was presented in 3 different ways. It was a 5,000-word traditional print story, text story, which never appeared in print anywhere. It turned into a 3-minute, 10-second Broadway song, which was watched by more people than watched the sort of story online or anything else, and it was a 1-hour This American Life episode. And I think in all of that combination, we managed to hit different kinds of people, different kinds of things. And if you go back and watch the song, you actually do get the whole story in the song. So, you know, the people who watch the song actually got something.
The Huffington Post does this every day with every story, and publishers complain, oh, they're ripping us off. But every time the Huffington Post condenses a story and sends a link back, which many people don't click, what they're doing is they're serving the audience that wants the huge meal in a pill. And you know, it hurts to have your beautiful 5,000-word investigation boiled down to 300 words by somebody else. But they do a very good job of it, and it shows that there's an audience that wants both the 8-course meal and the pill.
And if you're looking for impact, the fact that a large audience saw it in different ways is not necessarily a bad thing.
Right. Ma'am?
Yeah. Elaine Potter from the Bureau of Investigative Journalism in London. We're relatively new arrivals. We're actually very influenced by ProPublica in setting ourselves up. We grapple with many of the same issues and questions that have been raised here today. I'm particularly interested in the discussion about collaborations. You've obviously talked mostly about local and national collaborations, and I'm just wondering if there's any appetite or willingness to consider international collaborations. That's my question.
Sure. Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. We actually do collaborate with the BBC quite a bit, and when I don't mean we just like air different shows. I mean we actually do collaborate from the beginning. And we've been doing that more and more. We just had a film on Syria that came out on Tuesday night that originated actually out of Channel 4. So we're increasing the amount of cross-collaboration we do, especially with the Brits, and it's just been incredible. But I mean, we could go further than that as well.
Yeah, well, the BBC and Channel 4 are obviously such well-established brands that there's no risk and not much of a challenge in collaborating with them, is what.
Well,
it depends.
We recently
that's not entirely true.
We recently did a story with the Polish television network TVN, so I think that's not as well established a brand. And I have to say, the guy who called us up out of the blue had internal information on an investigation of American companies bribing people in Poland that was quite fascinating and broke some news. So we're quite open to it.
Well, just in the past week, we've seen this incredible collaborative investigation about tax havens around the world.
Right.
Mm-hmm. That was really quite something.
Yeah, my name's Stan Gould. I used to work for this guy, Cronkite. And a couple of times guys said to me yesterday that they felt pressure to get their stories on the internet edition. And you're saying it's a good thing, I mean, to get a boiled down version, that you're not afraid of going too fast.
Well, I think it's instructive that rather than complaining, oh, a shorter version of our story reached millions of people, the New York Times, or as Steve points out, ProPublica already does this. Maybe it's very wise to downsize that piece and fit it in something that works in a phone, or very quickly while somebody's surfing.
Because if we don't do it, somebody else is going to
Exactly.
do it. Somebody else is going to take our thing and summarize it. It's going to be a tweet. We should do it.
Plus, you don't have to guess. Audience will tell you. I mean, because we collaborate with a lot of people in the same. I mean, the way journalism has become narrowly focused, we can sell the same piece of content at CIR to 4 or 5 different media outlets in the Bay Area because they no longer overlap. I'm sad to say for traditional media. But we end up doing different versions, as Steve does, different versions of the story. And in answer to the international question, I mean, this isn't exactly a collaboration. I said I wouldn't talk about the shooter story. But CIR turned what was an Esquire 15,000-word piece into a graphic illustration video. And that video from one source in France, which was translated into French, 350,000 views in a day and a half, which isn't viral, but it's pretty big for us.
And I think we also need to be cautious not to assume that people under 40 will not read a long substantive story. We did a a long, in-depth series last year about Amazon's abysmal record as a corporate citizen. And I got to tell you, dropping that down in a Sunday printed newspaper in Seattle started a community conversation like nothing else can. And you walked into coffee shops all over town, and there's 20-year-olds just voraciously eating this thing up. Day after day, our single copy sales were up, our web traffic was up, and people read it.
Another question? Joy?
I've been listening very attentively the whole time I've been here, and there's a concept or a designation I haven't heard, and I'm interested in knowing why. Is the phrase citizen journalist a name for you? I've long cared about collaborative work, and I know there are a lot of, quote, citizen journalists out there who are jerks. I mean,
well, journalists
and
out there are
non-citizen
jerks.
journalists.
Yeah. On the other hand, I would think there would be an amazing kind of treasure or opportunity for collaboration with people who are known as...
Anybody here taken, that sort of collaboration route?
Well,
with
we've done it in a slightly different way. I think when the internet sort of started and people said this is going to be great, people are going to bring you investigative stories, from out and about in the community and in the nation, and they're just going to arrive kind of fully baked. That was fairly optimistic and has not transpired. What we have seen is that if you go to your audience and enlist them in a specific question, you can do very well. And so we tend to call it distributed reporting rather than citizen journalism. It amounts to the same thing. At one point we were trying to figure out where various members of Congress stood on the question of SOPA, the Internet Privacy Act. And so one of our developers wrote a piece of software and created a news application where, position, question mark. And many, many members of the public would call the office, would send us a link, would send us a press release, and we were able in a matter of a day and a half or so to fill in the actual position of every member of Congress virtually on this important piece of legislation. So that worked brilliantly. It worked so brilliantly that when some of these members of Congress saw what their position was, they called us up and changed it. So that was...
The media did a similar thing where they wanted to figure out who was putting a block on a piece of legislation. So every week, Brooke Gladstone would say, call your senator and ask him, are you the one who's putting the block on? And they created enough pressure so that they were able to actually identify who had put the secret block.
I think there's a semantic problem with citizen journalism, because then we spend all our time arguing, what's the line between the two and where does it one end and the other begin. And I think ultimately the citizens you're talking about are citizens we need to tell our story, to help us know what's going on in the community, and the technology allows us to reach them and them to reach us. And that's what I think is the best use of citizen information, not having them develop it as journalists when they're not journalists. That's what we're here to do. Doesn't mean we don't want to participate with them.
My old boss, Michael Kinsley, used to say that he didn't mind citizen journalism, but he didn't like the idea of a citizen chef. He said he didn't want he didn't want his meal made by the guy sitting next to him. He wanted the guy who was earning a salary, who was in the kitchen. I have a question over here.
Edward Wong from the Beijing Bureau of the New York Times and previously from Baghdad. My question is, with all the talk about quantification of impact, for foreign reporting, how would you go about quantifying impact, especially when the story doesn't have an angle that's in the U.S.? For example, if it's not about bad toothpaste from China coming to the U.S. or Blackwater contractors in Iraq or something like that, how would you, focus on the impact or the importance of those stories?
I think when the New York Times story came out about the money that the royal families there were pulling down, I think time stopped. I think there was just like no other way to quantify the impact of that story other than everybody read it, or everybody who was remotely interested, and it became the subject of many conversations. Here we are, what, 6 weeks later, 8 weeks later, and we're still talking about it and learning from it and absorbing it.
The best part, it used to be those of us who were newspaper editors, you'd have these marketers come in and they'd tell you that your audience, your readership, always wanted international news but never read it. But they want, you know, if they had a newspaper that they were loyal to, that you had to have international news, and they just didn't care about it. Now, I'm not sure that was ever entirely true, but now I think with sort of more segmentation, that there's more opportunity for an audience to be interested in international news and more places for them to go to see it. So I think, you know, getting back to your impact, I agree with Jack completely. I think time did stop. Now, whether that created a change in leadership in Beijing, that's another story. But I think there's definitely, you can get the shockwave effect, and that's a measurement in and of itself.
Right, and I think we aggressively have to tell that story, Ed. Actually, I think when we do these international stories, I'll just talk about Syria for a minute. It just had such a huge blast, and was an amazing conversation that happened around it. But we were really aggressive in getting the word out about the film. And what we saw, actually, our audience figures after that were up by 23% from our last Syria broadcast. So we're doing something right to say, hey, you got to watch this stuff. So. And we're also putting shorter pieces on, like the unedited version of pieces, so that we can gain more attention ahead of the broadcast. So I think you just have to be more clever about getting
And at the risk of sounding like a panelist rather than a moderator, if a great story has no impact, that doesn't mean it wasn't worth doing.
That's right.
And
yeah,
you know,
right.
if you're examining your navel and running, oh, should we do it this way or that way because we have to maximize income, maximize the impact this way or that way. You know, sometimes you really have to put that behind. If it's a great story, if you believe in it, you've got to do it.
And you know, I'll have to say, you know, the thing about working at Univision is we have an audience that demands that we do foreign reporting. So perhaps if your publication appeals to that audience as ours, they will too demand it. We have to do it every day because that's what the audience
Keith,
wants.
I think you mean international.
International
report,
news,
not foreign.
Yes, I'm sorry, international.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, Ed.
He's not gonna ever call on you, Lowell. He's never going to call on you. It's your panel. He's not.
In fact, we're going to take the microphone.
We've heard paid for that microphone.
I've got it now.
It's all right. I get the last word.
I'd be curious to hear from the panel what you think that journalism education should be doing to ensure a good future for investigative journalism.
Yeah, I'll jump into that because I have some strong thoughts. You know, I think there was a period in journalism education not too long ago when they said that you needed to learn how to shoot video and cut video, and you needed to be a multimedia expert, and it was all very vocational. I think the most valuable thing journalism education can first and foremost do is teach young journalists how to verify a fact, find a fact, make sure it's a fact. I don't mean to sound like a fogey, but when it's all said and done, if you cannot figure out and verify the facts and the basis and foundation of your story, you are in deep, deep trouble, no matter how many videos you can cut and shoot. The other thing I would say very strongly is that there are some skills and things that you might want to know. Beyond that, you know, it actually would be useful to know a little bit about the history of our country and its political system. That's not such a bad thing. And one other thing I would pitch for, no joke, statistics. If you honestly cannot navigate and understand numbers, you know, forget it. You're going to be in trouble in this line of work for the rest of your life because we are moving into an era where you need to understand data. And the period when journalists could be afraid of numbers, I think, is past. So.
I just want to build on Steve's first point. I think a lot about this as well, and I think that the number one imperative is to try to, I don't know if this is something you can teach so much as encourage, what I think of as the courage of curiosity. And we live in an age where I think this is in such shortage, and I actually think it's a tremendous threat to the democracy. You know, we see people moving into these information silos that are essentially echo chambers. There's a quote on this that I just absolutely love from James Carville where he says, Americans these days use the media the way a drunk uses a lamppost, for support, not illumination. And I think we just have to instill that in young journalists, this sense of the best investigative stories start with questions to which we don't know the answers.
As a drinker, I think it's a really good use of a student. Is that a microphone in your hand, or do you just want to talk to us?
I just want to amplify actually what you just said and some of the conversation about the attempt by the Gates Foundation or anyone else to put metrics in this subject, because my personal experience is that many of the stories I've done have had no impact, yet they were investigative stories, some at great length. In fact, they may have done the reverse. For instance, we did at 60 Minutes a series of stories about the then expanding California prison system, which was the largest public works project in the United States at the time. All the mail was build more of them, and they kept building them. So you never know what the story is, where the story is going to go or what's going to happen. On the other hand, Frontline sent 2 of us into East Africa in the wake of the 1998 bombings. No one watched that documentary, basically very small audience when it was on the air. 9/11 happened, and the vice president himself sent a limousine to pick up a copy, and it became the most rebroadcast documentary, at least in memory. So you don't know in this business, isn't there a danger that when you get people like Gates, the people who have the money, start to put metrics on it and define what is worth funding, that we're going to have a real crisis in terms of actually doing entrepreneurial reporting?
Yes, absolutely. But Lowell, I think
I'm
those
going to
stories
send a
need to
letter
be told.
to Bill Gates saying, no
No,
thanks.
you
Keep your
have
money.
to tell those stories. You have to tell those stories. I think maybe Mike said you have to educate the foundations, the supporters of this, to just really take them under the hood about what investigative journalism is. And I know that's a conversation we have a lot with individual donors and also foundations. I think they're pretty, willing to listen to you. And if you have examples like that, that's a great one. Other ones, anecdotal, real life examples, you could probably convince them. But we've had success with it.
And I do have to jump to their defense here and say that they have hired significant journalists to work for them to help them understand this sort of thing. People like Dan Green and others who have done significant work.
Got time for one more question.
Just a quick one. Gavin McFadden from London, from the Center for Investigative Journalism. We do almost exclusively training for investigators, and we found exactly what Stephen was saying to be true, that the numbers that we are now a normal part of our training process have been, after 10 years, wildly accepted. And now The Guardian has a huge numerical system, The Telegraph, the Sunday Times does, BBC is now doing the same kind of work. But we found now that that's become a kind of legitimate language for journalism and for investigators, that the issue of surveillance has become a very large part of our consciousness. And so we're now training people on a very large scale, and increasingly will do now, in how to protect sources, how to protect stories, how to protect you and your family as journalists, because the level of surveillance in Europe, and nothing like as serious as it is here, is regarded as a major threat. And towards that end as well, we've done one other thing which we didn't even think of a couple of years ago, which is to set up defense organizations for whistleblowers. And we now are initiating organizations to protect whistleblowers with free lawyers, psychological counseling, and all the rest of it. Anyway, that's what we're doing abroad.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you, Gavin, and thank the panel. Actually, I want to thank, once again, Alicia Klatt, Marlena Telvik, Elisa Jaffer, and Nadine Jubar, for putting all this together, for making all you comfortable. And we'll see you next year.